In a quiet attic in New York, Blanche Moses carefully preserved two miniature ivory portraits. She believed they depicted her noble Jewish ancestors, that is to say, in the best light possible, refined, European, and elite. You can imagine the pinky out. For Blanche, these portraits were more than heirlooms. They were proof of belonging, status, and of a family history that fit neatly into the story she had always been told. But when scholar Laura Arnold Leibman followed the trail, she uncovered a very different past. The portraits were not of European aristocrats, but of Sarah and Isaac Brandon, siblings born into slavery in Barbados. They would later become free and wealthy in New York, navigating a world where race, religion, their Jewishness, and class collided in complex and often hidden ways. In Once We Were Slaves, Leibman traces the extraordinary journey of the Brandon family, revealing how identity is not fixed, but forged through migration, reinvention, and the stories families choose to tell. Laura joins us to explore how family history can challenge the narratives we inherit and reshape our understanding of who we are and where we come from. Welcome to Reunion, a podcast about how family history helps us understand the past and why it still matters today. This series is sponsored by the Center for Family History and Genealogy and the Family History Program at Brigham Young University, which offers the world's only undergraduate degree in family history. I'm Joey Stewart, and I'm here with my co-host and colleague, Christopher Jones. We're both assistant professors of history and faculty in BYU's Family History Program. Every 2 weeks, we talk with scholars, educators, and storytellers who use family history to explore big questions about history, kinship, and identity. Studying families helps us see what mattered most to people in the past and how those values shape the world we live in now. Family history is more than names and dates. It gives historians a flexible method for understanding everything from slavery and migration to religious conversion and cultural memory. This is Reunion. We're glad you're here.
Laura Arnold Leibman is the Leonard J. Milberg 53 Professor in American Jewish Studies at Princeton University. She is the author and editor of multiple books, including the award-winning Once We Were Slaves, The Extraordinary Journey of a Multiracial Jewish Family, which traces the life of a Caribbean-born Jewish family who rose from enslavement to prominence in early New York. Her work blends genealogy, material culture, and digital humanities to uncover stories that challenge conventional narratives of race, religion, and belonging. Thanks for being here, Laura.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so I want to start out at a very broad level here with an opening question. Your book, Once We Were Slaves, explores the life of Jewish families of color in early America. Can you tell us more about the origins of this particular project, how you were introduced to the Brandon family, and why you chose to write about them?
I first got introduced to the Brandons by a colleague who's now passed away, who was telling me all about some of the different moments that had happened with the religious community on the island of Barbados, which had been hidden in the Barbadian Jewish records. And really, I was not that interested in them, honestly, to begin with. They were kind of a side narrative I was working on an earlier time. And it was like, Carl, super fascinating. People did all sorts of things, not what I'm working on. But after I stopped talking to him, I thought, you know what? Isaac Lopez Brandon. I kind of remember that name. I think I've seen an ivory miniature of this guy. So I went back and I looked at the objects that I lovingly gaze at all the time. And sure enough, he was somebody that had this miniature made of him. And I thought, wow, okay, this is actually now fascinating to me, because this is a miniature that everybody had just assumed was a European Jew, like all the other ones that were in the collection at American Jewish Historical Society. But instead, what I now understood was this was the first multiracial portrait of a Jew that we knew of from the Americas. And that really changed my understanding of the miniature, and also suddenly lent this backstory to somebody who I hadn't thought of as relevant to the stories that I had been telling. So suddenly I became interested in them, not because there had been this moment in Barbadian history where there had been this uproar in a synagogue, like that was interesting to me, but because I had a portrait of somebody. And I think that really speaks to the way that I tend to do history. I'm interested in objects, and textual story of him getting in trouble was interesting to me, but having that moment where I could see what somebody looked like in the past really made the story human to me in ways that made me want to keep following the story and to find out more about him.
Can you say more about how family history helped you uncover the narratives, the family stories of these people? You started with this single picture and then lay out this complex genealogical narrative here. Did you have experience doing family history of this sort before? And how did family history help you in telling this previously hidden story?
I think of myself as somebody who has pretty much always worked on family history. My early work was on the Wampanoag community of Martha's Vineyard, and I worked on a 4 generational history of the island. And really, a lot of the information we knew about the people came from genealogical work. So even early on, before I worked on Jews in the colonies, I was interested in how the information that people wanted to preserve about families influenced the way that we could tell history. And a lot of that is brought into this project, even though it's several books later, that for me, the story of these siblings is so embedded in what their parents' stories were and what their children's stories are. And as you began in the introduction with Sarah, the sister of Isaac Lopez Brandon, the sister's granddaughter, and that she decides to preserve family history and donate everything about the family to an archive. So there's a way in which, without people's interest in family history, the work of the historian is a little bit not available, right? We're so indebted to descendants who decide that they want to make their families part of a larger American history in terms of what resources are left. So definitely, I see my work as a historian is super intertwined with family history on a number of different levels.
I'm fascinated that you started out with a study of the Wampanoag Nation, and I'm wondering how your use of genealogical methods or sources have changed from Massachusetts to Barbados, and what sort of sources have been most valuable to you, in addition to things like portraits that you study.
Definitely working on Native American communities in the colonial period is difficult for many reasons, but one of them is there are so few sources that remain. And the Wampanoag community at Martha's Vineyard, I was fortunate that there were more materials remaining than in other places. But when I started to transition into working on Jewish communities in early America, I remember another historian say to me, "I'm amazed that you can find anything." It's like, you have no idea how few materials there could be. The Jews tended to be wealthier than the people who were in the Wampanoag community and in other parts of indigenous communities in New England. So for me, I was going from a really limited source group to a larger source group, but I still brought with a lot of my interest in thinking outside the box in terms of what sources I could rely on. So when I was working on Native American communities, I really paid attention to what kind of houses did people live in, what gravestones were there, what kind of baskets were people weaving, all these kinds of different materials that could shed light on people's personal histories. And I brought that sort of methodology with me when I started working on Jews in early America. Again, there were so many more things that survived, which was lovely as a resource, but I still was interested in how could I find material that would highlight the people we normally don't hear from in histories. So particularly women and children, the elderly, I would say also single women. A lot of times we only have information in written records from women who got married. So I really wanted to know, what about the people who didn't have descendants that they passed along material to? How could objects potentially help unlock their histories and their part of family stories?
How does one use material culture like heirlooms or portraits or looking at gravestones or whatever the other material objects may be as genealogical evidence? I think a lot of times when individuals think about both historical research and genealogical research, they're thinking about the written words, they're thinking about legal records or church records or census records. How do you use material culture as genealogical evidence?
I think it depends on what the object is, what kind of information it can provide. I'm going to bet that most people out there doing family history research at some point go to a cemetery or find a grave.com or something like that, right? There's so much information on gravestones that's genealogical that people are looking like, what was the name of the father? What year did they die? Does it tell me anything about how they died? I often am trying to get away from, just the facts, man, and more into the emotional lives of people and their everyday existence. And I think you heard a little bit of that when I was saying, oh, I'm really interested in houses and how does living in a particular kind of house shape the kind of values that I have? Or how do I place my values into the house? And so, hence, a house might tell me about what somebody in a particular family thought was important. And for me, at least, when I'm doing genealogical work for my own family or when I'm writing histories, that's what I want to know about. I don't want to just hear they died in this place and they were born in this time and this was their father. I want to know something about the personalities of the people. And I do think that things like the miniatures are great that way. That one of the things that I've done with Sarah Brandon Moses's miniatures is to really look at what kind of clothing are they wearing? How does the style of the clothing tell me about their attempts to navigate race during this time period? Clothing is very racialized during the 18th century and the early 19th century, as are choices about fabrics. So for me, those miniatures give me a lot of information, not just about how they looked, but what kinds of choices they made on a daily basis and how they navigated society.
It reminds me of something that you wrote about a while back on Jewish American material culture. You're examining a Fisher Price set. So for those who don't have kids or grandkids or haven't encountered these are little play sets that are realistic, but not super realistic in the figures that they use. You write, Jewishness is what one wears, eats, plays, and does as much as what one reads. And then later on say material objects provide an important way to talk about the shaping of belief and identity. Is this something that you saw not only in the portrait, but in the stuff that the Brandon family had that allows you to better understand them as human beings rather than as people who are recorded in documents?
I think part of this for me goes back to even when we think about our own families, when I think about people who didn't leave written records, I think about the objects that they passed down to us. I'm really interested with the Brandon family. I don't have anything that Sarah wrote. So how do I access information about how she passed along values and Jewishness to the other people in her family? And one of the really interesting objects that I used in writing the history, it was a written document, but you'll see it's also like an object-y kind of document. One of her brothers-in-law goes on an early trip to India, and you're like, fantastic. I'd love to hear what a Jew thinks about going to India in early 19th century. It is the most boring thing you've ever read in your life. It's the wind was this so many knots. And then today the weather was that. And you're like, really? You went to India and that's what you got out of it? So unfortunate. But fortunately, his children and then Sarah's children, and also it looks like somebody, the other members of the children in the family also had this really boring journal that they then co-opted and they doodled in and they did all these drawings about what was going on. So they drew a picture of their grandfather's house and they drew a picture of a fire engine. And you're like, they're doing all these things. And they practiced writing their name in this really distinctive Sephardic style where they do this little loop-de-loop, which is called a rubrica, underneath their names. And for me, you could see them passing along and imitating this idea of Sephardic identity in this space where they're not supposed to be doodling in their uncle's journal, but I'm so glad they did, right? Because that tells me how they're passing along identity and something really interesting about the family's notion of what's worth saving and what's worth being part of family history for each other, right? As opposed to, I'm only going to pass along things that mean something. Here, we're deliberately getting something passed along that it wasn't worthwhile for the family members so the children can doodle in it. For me, the doodles are exciting too.
In the introduction, you talk about, or you note that everything that we know about these women, and you're specifically referring here to Sarah, her mother, and her grandmother, is biased by the violent way the archives erase certain lives and privilege others. So we're talking about an enslaved woman here or enslaved women here, people that are thus racially and religiously marginalized in this Caribbean society. How does your work show how family history thus intersects with the histories of race or religion, of slavery or social mobility?
Part of what was so time consuming about this book was how much was missing from the archive. So I said earlier, yay, there's so much more stuff than I'm used to for families like this because the father had a fair amount of wealth. The descendants decide to preserve things. But there's also really big disparities between which members of the family were able to write, who people thought was worth preserving their information. So I really did feel like part of the story that needed to be told was what does it mean that certain people get kept out of the written records? And one of the big struggles that I had with the book was trying to think about not just the parts of Sarah and Isaac's family that were considered Jewish, but how do I account for the enslaved members of their family? And I spent a lot of times going through archives in Barbados as well as in England, looking for manumission records and other records related to the history of slavery within the family. I'm looking at old wills and deeds and whatnot, things that most people are like super boring, but also have really good information in them. And through that process, really trying to go back and build a history, not only of the Jewish side of their family, but their mother's side of the family, which was of African ancestry and which had been enslaved, and really thinking about what would be the impact of including that as part of the Jewish story. One of the things that seemed really important to me in including that part of the story was how would that then impact the lives of Sarah and Isaac as they were going forward. And in the process of going through all the boring wills and deeds and other archival records, one of the things that came out was their mother's brother, so their uncle, was married to the most important woman in early Barbados. So the first female national hero of Barbados, a woman of color who was very much involved in the civil rights movement on the island. And for me, this was like one of those moments of revelation because suddenly I could see like, oh, Isaac Lopez Brandon, he also is involved in civil rights. And that might be something he's getting from his mother's side of the family, that might be something that speaks to both parts of his family and how they're impacting his sense of justice and where he wants to go forward. So definitely for me, like thinking about that intersection of how race was impacting what wasn't surviving and how I needed to put in that extra effort to think about the impact of multiple strands of the family, even if one side was harder to find out information about them.
I'm thinking about the introduction to Laurel Thatcher Ulrich's book, A Midwife's Tale, where in the introduction, she talks about how everyone else had given up on Martha Ballard's diary because they thought it was so boring and there were so few details. And that's fortunate for Dr. Ulrich, who won a Pulitzer and a Pencroft and did all sorts of amazing things because she was willing to go through the sustained research of going day by day and finding the patterns in a person's life. But Christopher and I are Latter-day Saints. We teach at BYU, and we often teach Latter-day Saint students how to do genealogy. And one of the things that we really try to show our students is that there may be particular Mormon or Latter-day Saint ways of approaching an archive, and certainly the types of sources that archives that hold Mormon material are going to have. Do you see something similar going on with Jewish archives or Jewish approaches to preserving or telling family history?
So first of all, I will say we're all super grateful to the Mormon Church that they have digitized so many records, and this book would not be possible without it. And I feel like all the ability to go through the Barbados church records, which again does not seem like what a Jewish historian should be doing, is like only possible because of what the church has done. That's so particularly true now because of hurricanes and fires and whatnot. We've had so many losses of different archives. I think going forward, there's going to be a way in which all history is sort of indebted to that digitization project. So shout out to the Mormon Church for having done all that work that makes other history projects possible. In terms of Jewish history, I actually feel like in some ways my approach to Jewish family history pushes against a lot of the methods of Jewish understandings of history. One of the things that I kind of alluded to this with me talking about how important it was to research Sarah and Isaac's mother's side of the family and to not have a really narrow definition of who's a Jew. And I do feel like that the narrowing down and saying like, I'm only going to consider certain people as part of Jewish history obviously is necessary insofar as, hey, we called it Jewish history or Jewish genealogy for a reason. And it's because it was supposed to involve Jews. But the reality of the Jewish experience in the Americas is Jews often intermarry with other people or have relationships with other people. And so I would say a lot of my work sort of pushes back against how do I make those different genealogies speak to one another, and how much time do you spend going off into the different tangents. So in that sense, I would say it's complicating the Jewish story in certain ways that I think can help us get at some of the ways in which certain people have dropped out of the story because they weren't considered Jewish enough. I have an identical twin, and at some point my twin was trying to fight back against my father, who there was a big debate when we were born, whether we were identical or fraternal. And my twin sent me a DNA test so that we could test to see whether we're identical or fraternal. And it came back we were identical. Yay. But it also came back that my sister was like 1% more Jewish than me. And I was like, what the heck does that mean? She's 1% more Jewish? Wait, I'm like much more observant than she is. What is this DNA evidence really telling me? So I do think there are those moments of like, what does it mean to be more Jewish than something else? Like, what is a Jewish genealogy? What is a Jewish family history? I do think we're a little bit plagued by notions of who counts as Jewish in Jewish stories and in Jewish history, even as I said, by default, we need to have some boundaries, like what's the limit of my scope, but it can be a drawback too. And for me, at least, my sister may disagree, but I feel like the Jewish genealogy DNA story points at sometimes this is a flawed start for what is more Jewish than something else.
So I teach our university's course on genetic genealogy, and we actually use Jewishness as the example of the numbers don't actually mean anything without archival evidence to back it up. It's like, what does it mean that someone is 1% more Jewish or 4% more Japanese or whatever? And so it allows for a good space to talk about, like, what is a Jew? What is Judaism? What does it mean to be Jewish? I just think that it points out sources always require interpretation and to be measured against expectations of what other sources are there.
I first read this book a year or two after it came out. It had been recommended to me by a friend, and I thought, oh, this looks really good. I teach family history. I'm an early American historian. This seems very much like my thing. So I started reading it, and I love following the story. I love the movement across time. You're tracing this family from Barbados to New York to Ohio. So they kind of spread out, intermarry, and various things. What I was not expecting was to have your work directly intersect with both of my own not entirely related research interests. One of them is just finishing revisions on a book that, among other things, looked at Methodist missionaries to the Caribbean in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So I was really surprised to come across the story of Anne Gill and William Shrewsbury's kind of radical Methodist congregation in Bridgetown. So I was really excited. You know, you're reading something, you're not anticipating it, and that person's story or history intersects with your own research. And then I was thrown for another turn because, in addition to my research interests in sort of early Caribbean Methodism, I also currently serve as the editor of the Journal of Mormon History and have been active in sort of Latter-day Saint history circles for a number of years. And I was shocked to see Joshua Seixas, who is this Hebrew instructor, comes and is hired by Joseph Smith in Kirtland, Ohio in the 1830s to teach him and other leaders of the church to teach them about the Hebrew language. But one thing that was sort of revealed to me as I kept on encountering these stories from my own research interests was just how ranging the story that you're telling here is. Again, it's geographically expansive. It is archivally expansive. You looked at written records, you looked at church records, you looked at material culture records. And then on top of that, you're dealing with a really complicated histories and identities. So you note in the introduction, Sarah Brandon was sometimes called Sarah, sometimes Esther, sometimes Sarah Esther, and that her last name was as unstable as her first, shift from Lopez to Gill to Brandon, depending on who told her story in the colonial records or who claimed her as kin. That I was struck by how expansive, not only how detailed the research here is, but how expansive of an understanding of family and families are at play here. How do you define family? How does the research in this book challenge our understandings of what constitutes a family in terms of place, in terms of free versus enslaved status, or in terms of individuals whose descendants' names change, whose racial identities change over time, whose genetic links may be difficult to find or prove, and whose legal documentation is often sparse.
Wow. So I feel like defining family seems like it should be the easiest of things, and yet is so hard on some basic ways. And part of that is, as we all know, we kind of create our own family networks throughout our life. And we also give and take family networks as we change. I'll tell you this first part that I've been thinking a lot lately about different kinds of kinship. And I'm working on a book on Jews and fabric arts in the long 19th century. I've been working on schoolgirl samplers, and I've been really interested in the ways in which they both talk about actual genetic kinship, but they're also creating political kinship and national kinship. So for me, a lot of times the family unit becomes a way for people during this time period. They have talking about women's relationship to people outside of their genetic kin networks. It's a moment where really the notion of kinship is changing so that you're going from families which are constructed by wanting to create economic alliances and through arranged marriages, of which these little miniatures partake. They're a way of trying to cement alliances across time and space, to being stories that women are interested, and sometimes men, about romance. And then oftentimes in that shift, we start to get a lot of pushback against genetic families as being bad tellers of romance, that they aren't going to understand romance very well. I would say for me that this story was complicated by how do you deal with that shift towards romance? Because it turns out romantic relationships and romantic attempts to forge kinship are really hard to find records of. So some of the time, I don't know whether somebody stuck with somebody out of economic reasons or whether that was a relationship that there was actually an emotional tie. For me, at least as a historian, that's hard to figure out the evidence to go back and know why was somebody having this alliance and what pushed them forward. That's the long-winded thing. I think kinship is so complicated during this time period. In terms of family ties, for me, definitions of family during a period where there's slavery is so complicated because there's the people who are genetically related, and then there's the people who families acknowledge as kin. And those two are circles that don't always overlap completely. And at that place where they don't overlap, there's a lot of pain and trauma. So to a certain extent, when you're looking at the spaces where people have fallen out of the official family histories, there's both, I think, a need as a scholar to recognize how much sorrow must have been in those people's lives of people not recognizing them as part of their kinship, but also maybe some real life opportunities in terms of the histories that we write for reconnecting families and filling in gaps in families where people had fallen out of the records. It's definitely been so meaningful to me to see descendants being reconnected after reading this book and being able to go turn to things like DNA genealogy to find out, do they actually have kin ties that they thought might be existing? I think it's one of the really powerful ways in which genealogy today, in the world in which we live, both in terms of the digitization of sources as well as genetics, is really radically changing our understanding of family and trying to grapple with that past in which people fell out of family lines and trying to figure out, how do I make connections and reframe family in the midst of all that loss in the past?
It's something in the classroom, Christopher and I, as trained historians and now trained genealogists, is you have to really see the people you're researching as entire people. And that includes the good, the bad, the boring, the really exciting, and trying to come to grips with the complicated nature of human being. That's part of the value of adding family history research to our teaching repertoires, really helping to think about the different connections that people make as not just being people who maybe there are more primary sources because you can find those names, but because you can recognize this relationship really meant a lot to them in some capacity.
Apropos of that, I think there are moments too where we go back to family histories and we imagine we understand what things were like in the past. So I do remember one descendant who's now passed away saying to me that he had assumed after Isaac Lopez Brandon's son had married a non-Jewish woman that the Jewish family had given up on that side of the family and had just written them out. And I was able to bring to him a will that was written by Isaac's sister-in-laws, talking to their nephew's children and saying like, oh, he died, but we have these objects that meant so much and hold all this memory. So you could see them reaching out after even the person who had married out had passed away and wanting to keep those connections. There's also sometimes those moments where we imagine we understand how families worked in the past. And then the evidence gives you this moment of like, oh gosh, no, they really loved him so much. They didn't write him out because he married somebody that the father wouldn't have approved of. They wanted to maintain those connections and they worked hard and they used objects to do it, like many of us did. Many of us receive things from people who are passing away and they hold a piece of that person's memory and maintain those connections. And for me, at least, that is one of the kind of lovely things about working or focusing on objects is you can see how much power they hold for people to keep those family memories alive.
My grandfather passed away in 2020, and I have one of his old cardigans, so you can judge me accordingly, but I haven't washed it. I don't wear it very often. I keep it literally because it still smells like him. It's something that he used to wear around the house all the time. He would read it in. It's just a powerful reminder. Yes, you can trace our genealogical connection through census records or church records or things like that. But at the same time, there are so many more things that we can associate, right? Like I tell my students, can you tell the story of your life without your best friend? Can you tell the story of your life without your neighbor? Can you tell the story of your life without your third grade teacher? Do you think that family history or kinship histories have a particular way of speaking to scholarship to challenge dominant narratives that have long been the norm in academic publications?
I love that question. I do feel like there was this huge shift that happened in the second half of the 20th century towards social history, towards trying to include people who were not the normal actors or agents of history. It was a change from thinking about where does historical action happen? How do societies change? And for me, the family history just opens up a really different dimension of how we think about what's important in a culture. It's not what military battles were fought. It's not about the person who accumulated the most money. It's about relationships. And I think for most of us, speaking personally, that those are the things that may feel ephemeral, but are the most satisfying for us. The things that make us feel like I've lived a good life are not the things I might expect in my obituary to be written about me, but the things that really enrich my daily existence, which are those random moments where I have somebody in my life who matters and that I've honored that memory of them. So I do think that family history has this potential to really help us think about our values and what it means to be human in a different way than other kinds of histories do. I don't think it's the only kind of history you have to do, but I do think it does have that potential to really help us think about our priorities and how we navigate our lives. As I move forward in my day, do I want to spend my time doing X or Y? And that the things that may not be giving me credit in society might be actually the most rewarding.
A closing question for you. Is there a book that you would like to tell listeners about that has maybe sparked your imagination in some sense?
Yeah, I love talking about books that I've read. I'm a huge reader. There's always some book that I think, "Whoa, that's the book that I want to emulate or that changes the way I think about things." One book that was huge for me early on as I started working in Jewish studies is Stephen Naylor's Rembrandt's Jews. And partially, it's just gorgeously written. I am a huge fan of short chapters. So having short, beautiful, kind of jewel-like chapters is singing the song of my people. But he also goes through and really looks at all these different kind of objects in it and how that could tell us different aspects of life. in doing so radically changes somebody who we thought we knew about with Rembrandt, a great artist. Again, it's kind of back to those relationships. Like, here is a relationship that most of us wouldn't have thought really mattered, and yet turns out to be really revealing in terms of his artistry and what's going on in everyday life in Amsterdam during that time period. Totally recommend it. Beautifully written, good illustrations, like really interesting information. Just one of those books that changes the way you feel about the past because it makes you feel like you have an entry point into it that you didn't even know existed.
Laura Leibman, thanks so much for joining us today on Reunion. Thanks for joining us on Reunion. Family history isn't just about names and dates, it's about relationships, and how those relationships have shaped laws, power, and the structures that govern our everyday lives. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please leave a review on your favorite podcast platform, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It really helps others find the show. We'll be back soon with more discussions about why family history matters, because family history is history.